From tree huggers to shapeshifters to seers and magical crafters to Ursoc in World of Warcraft, Killeth in Critical Roles, Vox Machina and Getafix in Asterix and Obelisk, let us talk about Druids. Hello you funky people, Funky Monkey here, welcome to today's episode. How are you? How was your week? I genuinely hope it wasn't too stressful. On today's episode, we'll be talking about Druids, their origins and how they are represented today in TTRPGs, MMORPGs and well in general. As you might expect, there is more myth than reality surrounding Druids nowadays, but this was somehow the case even millennia ago. Just as a disclaimer, although we nowadays see Druids in a fun way with silly quirks and a tree lover's attitude, there are sources that support the idea that they also had a very dark side, and I will make sure to cover it because it is part of history and because it could inspire you in your world building. But I really wanted to warn you just in case. Don't worry, I will give you an advance warning for when things really take a turn for the dark. With that disclaimer out of the way, let me tell you about the miniatures I will be painting today. These are flesh golems from Norzul's Marvelous Miniatures series. Just as a fair warning, I went with something a little stranger, but I wanted to highlight the darker aspect of the miniatures in sync with the darker side of Druids. I know, it's not really in the theme with the story, but I kinda needed flesh golems, not a druid, so what can I do? But before we dive in, if you want to see more of Mango and Potato's adventures, make sure you check out TW Creative - Cats, a channel with shorts that have nothing to do with history but everything to do with cat adventures. Of course, check it out after you watch this video, just don't go wandering off because you heard the word cats. Now, let me tell you what plans I have for these miniatures and then we'll jump in our story. Let's go to the minis. The plan is simple. After base coating with Bello Black, I will go with Administratum Grey for an intermediary layer and finally Zenithal Prime with Bello White from above. I will apply a coat of Bugman's Glow to all 4 minis, and once that is dry, I will decide what colors to use depending on what humanoids I believe were involved in all of this, to put it nicely. I will go with 4, 5, even 6 different skin colors as to represent multiple individuals. I also remember that this was a fantasy setting, so I also included parts from a lavender tiefling just to add to the oddness and even gruesomeness of this paint job. To make it even more gruesome, I will try to mix and match the parts as to complete at least 4 individuals. With that out of the way, let us go through the checklist. I don't have any coffee on hand today because it's quite late in the evening and I already had 2 coffees today, so I don't want to get jittery. But I do have some wonderful butterfly pea tea. As you can see, it is blue. And I don't have my moose cup, but it's still a wonderful cup and a very wonderful tea. And I also have something for the soul, and I have one of my assistants sleeping in her little fluffy cave right over there close to me. How about you? Are you comfy cozy? Do you have something tasty to drink on hand? Perfect, then I think it's time for a story. The first mentions of Druids come from ancient Roman and Greek sources. Actually, the Greek sources preceded the Roman sources. But the Druids existed long before the Greeks or Romans ever encountered them, depending on the theory you are going with, and of course, depending on whom you consider to be Celtic. But already I've started diverging from the topic. The basic idea is that Druids lived in societies that did not leave many, if any, written records, so we haven't uncovered sources written by Druidic hands, at least thus far. This presents us with a conundrum, both because, of course, Roman and Greek sources are somewhat skewed, showing the Druids in a not very stellar light, and because by the time the ancient sources were written, the Druids were already in the decline. We do also have medieval Irish sources, but by the time those were written, hundreds of years have passed since the Druids were a thing, and some sources were written through a Christian lens, again distorting the image. But I'll do my best and paint a picture of Druids with what we have. But let's start with the beginning and talk about their name, Druids. Where does it come from? The word itself derives from the Latin druides or druide, druad in Old Irish, and driu in Welsh. There is also an old belief that was debunked long ago, stating that it was actually a Celtic compound word comprised of druvid and s, knowledge and oak, basically meaning knowledge of the oaks. But as I said before, it has long been disproved. They were closely related to bards in the Celtic world, with the bards being historians, keepers of knowledge, tutors and advisors. If you wanna know more about the history of bards, make sure you check out my 2-part episode on them, link is right over there. Similarly, Druids' role in society was very important, and they had many benefits that came with the job, among which not paying taxes and not serving in the military, as Julius Caesar tells us in his works De Bello Gallico. Druids were tasked with taking care of the spiritual needs of the community and had a monopoly on religion. They oversaw sacrifices, including human sacrifices, according to some sources. They were healers who used sacred plants in their potions, such as mistletoe, and knew how to ward off illness. If we are to believe Asterix and Obelix, they were also tasked with making magic potions that empowered Celtic warriors when fighting Romans, but I think that might be an exaggeration. They were advisors to rulers, and being knowledge repositories, they also oversaw judicial matters, such as disputes over inheritance, conflicts over lands and boundaries, even criminal cases, because they knew the lineage of people, the old boundaries over time, and how land was sold and bought and exchanged, and how inheritance was dealt with, etc., etc. In their service to the ruler, they also oversaw the oath taken by warriors when entering service, and they were seers as they interpreted signs sent by gods in various forms. The signs of their office were, according to archaeological finds, impressive headgears that did not serve any military purpose. They were made of bronze and decorated with natural motifs such as leaves, cones, discs, flowers, etc. And some of the times they wore horns and antlers, just like Cunliffe. They were also dressed differently than the rest of the community, perhaps in robes. It is unclear what, if any, hierarchy Druids had within their ranks, as there are no sources that clarify that. But we do know that there was some kind of hierarchy because of something Caesar mentions. He writes that the chief Druid was elected for life. This clearly indicates that there was a chief among Druids, and we can extrapolate and say that there was a hierarchy based on experience, if nothing else, especially since Caesar also tells us that they spent 20 years learning the oral traditions of their Druid masters. Now, because their knowledge was transmitted orally, much of it has been lost to time, as you might imagine. The fact that it was passed down like this could indicate the fact that they might have wanted to make sure it was not something everybody had access to, giving them much more power over their community, which sources support actually. But it also allowed them to select the most promising members of the community to teach, giving them, again, more power over their community. Apparently, they did use Greek scripts in certain circumstances, at least according to sources. Although I am sure not all Druids knew how to read and write. Let's be honest, not all Druids had contact with the ancient Greeks, not all of them really wanted to adopt a script, and not all of them felt the need to learn to write and read depending on their needs. And again, it was a way to ensure that knowledge was kept within their ranks. Now, by the time the Romans started writing about them, the Celts had been in contact with societies that had writing for some 100 years, and still they did not use writing to pass down their knowledge, in order, again, to hold on to the influence they had over their community. But also there is another reason that could be quite insightful, and I will quote Caesar here as he puts it best. Nor those who learn to devote themselves the less to the effort of memory, relying on writing, since it generally occurs to most men that in their dependence on writing they relax their diligence in learning thoroughly and their employment of the memory. They wish to inculcate this as one of their leading tenets, that souls do not become extinct but pass after death from one body to another, and they think that men, by this tenet, are in a great degree excited to valor, the fear of death being disregarded. They likewise discuss and impart to the youth many things respecting the stars and their motion, respecting the extent of the world and of our earth, respecting the nature of things, respecting the power and the majesty of the immortal gods. Of course, perhaps this wasn't universally true. Perhaps there were Druids who wrote down some of their teachings as to not forget them, and perhaps these writings were simply lost to time, but who knows? According to Caesar, they made this a very important point in their job description, to use your memory and not write down things as to not forget them, to constantly exercise your mind. When it comes to the power they held in their communities, Caesar puts it best in his writings, saying that because of the great advantages that come with a job, many embrace it willingly, while others try to use their connections and relations with Druids to have their children become Druids themselves. Now, imagine knowing that if you as a Druid were banished, or if you as a community banished your Druids or lost them in any way, the community would be left without a spiritual guide, a healer, a soothsayer, and no one else could replace them other than another Druid, perhaps brought in from the outside. Bringing an outsider to fill in that role had its advantages and many disadvantages, with the advantage being that they may be more objective when passing judgment or bringing in new knowledge, and the disadvantage being, well, quite obvious: not knowing the community, not knowing their traditions, their lineages, their boundaries, their laws, nothing. This gave Druids power over their community, like local priests throughout history and even to this day. In isolated or small communities, the priest is very important and they serve that community for life usually, and when they have to be replaced because of natural death or because of incidents, it is very hard for a new representative to earn the trust and the support of the local community. And imagine you really wanted your kid to become a Druid, or that the Druid passingly mentions that your kid had potential. This was a very good opportunity. The job came with a lot of perks, so you might need to be extra friendly with your local Druid. Again, more power to them, literally. Of course, these are just perhaps only some examples, or perhaps even Caesar's embellishments as to highlight the nepotism and the shirking of one's duties towards their community by avoiding serving in the military. But I do believe that people would be people regardless of the day and age they are living in. Of course, this was not universal. Not everybody abused their power and position to benefit over the interests of the community. But if history teaches us anything, is that history is peppered with jerks who milk it for all it's worth. On the other hand, truth be told, as in the case of bards, most likely the Druids would select as apprentices kids who were bright and curious, hungry for knowledge, not the village idiots. So even if you were extra friendly with your local tree lover, your kid might simply not make the cut. The Druidic society was a closed one with intelligent and creative people, sort of proto-scholars if you may, but that's just my opinion. Pliny the Elder also mentions that they would go out at night in their sacred groves, and under the moonlight they would gather sacred herbs using their golden sickles. This contributed to the modern image we have of Druids. Now, let's dive deeper in the day-to-day role of a Druid. But before we do so, if you found any value in this video thus far, make sure you hit that like button, make sure you show me some love and subscribe, as this tells me you want to find out more, and make sure the bell is on so you are notified whenever I release another video in the wild. And if you want, share this video with your friends, your players, your DMs, your GMs, neighbors, grandparents, cousins, pets, everyone, so that others are bored too. Let's now see how the painting job is how the painting job is coming along, and then we'll continue, so stick around. I feel a little weird describing this paint job, to be honest. I don't know why, but I will imagine this is 40k and just push through it. Once I applied the skin colors I decided upon, I came in with Reichland Flesh Shade to tie them all together and make the parts seem somewhat fresh. Okay, that sounded really weird. But I made sure not to apply it on the bluish-white body parts as they will be shaded with purple. These parts belong to a lavender tiefling guardsman who fell defending the entrance to a massive dungeon. The paint job is odd and I like it, although at this point it looks like things don't really go together. But I think this is the whole point of a flesh golem. What do you think? Do they look any good? Leave a comment down below, I'm very curious. Although I have listed some of the roles Druids filled in society, we need to dive deeper. The Druids were the spiritual leaders in their communities. They would read signs sent by the gods, interpret them, and make sure that the religious traditions were followed. They had it in their powers to banish people from their ritual life, basically excommunicating them for not following or respecting the interpretations or traditions that the Druids put forth. In essence, isolating these individuals within their own communities, making them unclean, making them outsiders. If you think that that is pretty weird, don't worry, it still happens to this day among clergy of all rights. It was either listen to the Druid or risk isolation, and in the Middle Ages was either listen to the priest or the imam or risk isolation, and so on and so forth. They would also impose taboos, also known as Gaius, or simply put, they would impose restrictions on individuals as a form of punishment, ranging from not allowing them to eat certain things to not allowing them to do certain things. It was believed that ignoring these punishments, these Gaius, would bring bad fortune or even death upon the perpetrator. Moreover, they would be called upon to interpret and explain strange natural phenomena. Of course, the god would always send a message that the Druid would be able to understand and then explain to their community. They were expected to calm storms, bring rain during droughts, appease the gods, and ensure prosperity to the community and even victory in battle. It was believed that they would also, as mentioned earlier, be able to foretell the future through different means. Usually this involved either watching the flights of birds, listening to the songs of birds, watching the behavior of animals, but it would also involve sacrifices and divining the future through this practice. This was not something new in the ancient world, as the Romans, for example, would carry out animal sacrifices. One of the most famous being the Suoveta Aurilia, when they would sacrifice a swine, a sheep and a bull. The liver of these animals would then be examined and the signs interpreted. Or they would use chickens and observe how they ate on a particular day, or count the number of eagles in the sky, but all of these are, as you might expect, another story for another time. But something that the Romans nor the Greeks do was to offer human sacrifices. Now, be warned, we're reaching a gruesome part. I'll let you know exactly when we'll start talking about that. And if you want to skip it, you are welcome to do so, I won't hold it against you. If the sources are true, and this was actually something that was commonly performed, it is really sick and disturbing, but it is part of our history. There is no reason to hide from it. And it brings out the darker side that allows us to better understand ancient societies. Before we start, these information survived in ancient sources, both Roman and Greek. Both of these people had a very deeply rooted sense of entitlement and superiority when it came to their view of other civilizations and cultures. This entitlement is neither rooted nor removed from reality. We are not here to debate the merits of such a sentiment, but through this lens, in order to nurture the sense of superiority, there are moments when the Romans and the Greek would take truths and embellish them, highlighting or exaggerating certain aspects, so they could reconfirm their moral high ground when compared to outsiders of their society. They would create a clear distinction between them and the barbaricum, the world outside of their borders. The Greeks would do the same, mind you, as you saw if you watched my video on werewolves. Link is right over there. Actually, everybody does this. Even to this day, we highlight certain aspects of our own nation and society and disparage others, so we can claim a higher moral ground. It's human nature. Although wrong, it's still human nature. But it does become a problem when we only have one side of the story. Again, the Romans would take truths and embellish them, but at the end of the day, they are, at least in my opinion, truths. There are grains of truth in the stories. And moreover, there are some archaeological evidence that would indicate that these grains of truth are actually there. The Romans would accept anyone within their territory to a certain degree, of course, if they followed Roman law, if they paid taxes and did not cause trouble. But I do want to emphasize the idea of following the Roman law. This meant perhaps renouncing certain traditions and practices. Now, with this very lengthy disclaimer out of the way, you can skip this next part, although I recommend you don't, as I will try to be as civil as possible. I want you to get a clear picture of Druids. Ready? If you haven't skipped, here we go. Diodor Siculus, the ancient Roman author, mentions in his writings that human sacrifices were practiced by Druids. These sacrifices were dedicated to certain gods. Teutatis, the father of the tribe, Essus, god associated with nature and rivers, and Taranis, a god of thunder. It is believed they did this to appease the gods, to divine the future or ensure something, be it a victory in war, plentiful crops, or other pressing matters. The sources mention that the Druids carrying out these kind of sacrifices would take the victim or victims and plunge a dagger in their chest. They would observe the twitching or convulsing of the victim's limbs and the gushing of the blood as they crumbled to the ground. And even the position they fell in was important and taken as a sign, a message from the god that they would interpret. Now, he also mentions that this would be done with criminals, but when there were no criminals available and the message had to be interpreted really fast, they would turn to other members of the community. They would also use prisoners of war for such divinations. Even Tacitus wrote in his Annals, "Their groves devoted to inhuman superstitions were destroyed. They deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives and to consult their deities through human entrails." There is some archaeological evidence to back this up, such as the Lindo Man, but in other cases the archaeologists cannot agree upon what the evidence point to, and this is to be expected. We need more evidence to support one side or the other. Another way of sacrificing victims in order to communicate with the gods was to hang them and observe their movements, or drowning them and I guess observing how they thrashed around, or by burning them alive before a wooden effigy, nowadays known as a wicker man. Or they would observe the threefold death. This is something peculiar and has survived from Proto-Indo-Europeans and can be observed in Indic, Greek, Celtic and Germanic mythology. This does deserve a video of its own, but you know the drill, it's another story for another time. In short, this is dying three ways: hanging, from a wound, and drowning, all at the same time. The best known legend describing this involved Merlin, but we will now look at Lucan's Pharsalia. Lucan mentions the following: "Et vibus imitis placatur sanguine diro tentates, horensque feris altaribus Jesus et Taranis Scythiae non meteor ara Diane." In translation, "And those who pacify with blood accursed savage Teutates, Jesus's horrid shrines, and Taranis' altars, cruel as were those lived by Diana, goddess of the north." To each deity, a certain cause of death was attributed. To Taranis, we can attribute the burning, to Teutates drowning, and to Jesus suspending somebody from a tree and mortally wounding them. This interpretation comes from the 10th century CE from the Commenta Berancia, a commentary made around this particular part of the text Lucan wrote down. By his full name, Marcus Annaeus Lucanus, shortly known as Lucan, born November 3rd, 39 CE, died April 30th, 65 CE, and was an ancient Roman poet and author who is best known for winning Nero's favor and for writing Pharsalia, also known as the Bello, describing the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey Magnus. He was forced to commit suicide at the age of 25 after he took part in a conspiracy to assassinate Nero, a conspiracy that was uncovered. In the 25 years he lived, according to sources, he wrote around 14 to 15 literary works, out of which only Pharsalia survived. Who knows, maybe we will get lucky enough to find his writings in Pompeii, Herculaneum, or some other library lost to time. As I mentioned earlier, an archaeological finding that supports both Druidic sacrifices and the threefold death is the Lindow Man, an ancient body found in the Londow Moss, Cheshire, England. A young man who lived in the 1st or 2nd century CE was found in a bog. He had mistletoe and burned oatcakes in his stomach and was killed in a classic threefold death. A blow to the head, strangled, and then had his throat slit. His body was placed in water for a while and then it was buried. And with that, let us move on to less gruesome details. But before we do so, let's take a look at the minis, see how everything is coming along, and then we can continue our story. Of course, as always, I struggle with painting in the eyes of miniatures. Perhaps it is obvious to you funky people, but for me it was a bit of a realization. If the miniatures are quite detailed, especially when it comes to their eyes, I don't have too much of a problem when painting them. But if the details are more faded, I do tend to mess it up really bad. Initially I tried with white as a base and then go in with red, as I wanted to make the eyes glow with, I don't know, blood magic or something. Then when I went in with a bit of red, it looked horrible, so eventually I just decided to make the eyes pitch black and leave it at that. Now for the stitches and sutures. Blood for the Blood God technical paint is just perfect for this task. I'll be honest, I kinda like how it looks thus far. How about you? What do you think? Do you like it? Let us continue with our story. The ancient sources do mention that the Druids had a Pythagorean view on life and death. The Pythagorean doctrine states that the soul is immortal and that it passes from one body to another. Basically, reincarnation, or how Pythagoras named it, metempsychosis. This is something Pythagoras stipulated around the year 530. Caesar, in support of this idea, writes, with regard to their actual course of studies, the main object of all education is, in their opinion, to imbue their scholars with a firm belief in the indestructibility of the human soul, which, according to their belief, merely passes at death from one tenement to another. For by such doctrine alone, they say, which robs death of all its terrors, can the highest form of human courage be developed. Subsidiary to the techniques of this main principle, they hold various lectures and discussions on the stars and their movement, on the extent and the geographical distribution of the earth, and the different branches of natural philosophy, and on many problems connected with religion. While Diodor Siculus mentions the human souls are immortal and after a prescribed number of years they commence a new life in a new body, when talking about the teachings of the Druids. The belief that the human soul was immortal is not limited to Celts or Druids. It can be found across the world and throughout time, and it is an interesting aspect of world religion to this day. Of course, all people around the world across time are afraid of death, or at least most of them, so it's easier and nicer and more comforting to believe that the soul is immortal and we will simply move on. Now, besides them being able to reincarnate, let's see where the idea of them being able to turn into animals and control the elements comes from. For this, we need to make a quick pit stop in Ireland, or Hibernia as the Romans called it, so we can establish something. You'll see what I mean. By the way, the name Hibernia comes from the Greek Euernia, that comes from the Celtic Iweriu, that later evolved into Eriu or Ira. Now, we need to establish that, although in general there are no mentions of women druids, or not many, in the Irish mythology there are many women druids that feature in prominent roles, so we know that there are at least some. With that being said and established, let's go back to shapeshifting, and for that we need to focus on the Galisane, virgin priestesses of the Isle de Seine of Pointe-du-Raz, Finistère in West Brittany, France. They are first mentioned by the ancient Greek geographer Artemidorus Ephesius and later by Strabo. Strabo mentions that the isle was off limits to men and that it was unclear which deity they served. Later, Pomponius Mela, the first Roman geographer, writes in the 1st century CE that they were practitioners of healing and counselors. His description goes like this. Senna, in the British Sea, opposite the coast of the Ossismi, is famous for its oracle of a Gaulish god, whose priestesses, living in the holiness of perpetual virginity, are said to be 9 in number. They called them Gallisane, and they believe them to be endowed with extraordinary gifts to rouse the sea and the wind by their incantations, to turn themselves into whatsoever animal form they may choose, to cure disease which among others are incurable, to know what is to come and to foretell it. They are, however, devoted to the service of voyagers only who have set out on no other errand than to consult them. As you can see, these 9 virgin priestesses were mentioned to be able to turn into animals, control the elements, and heal. And with stories like this surviving from antiquity and into Irish mythology, and with medieval scholars having access to such ancient accounts, we now have the basis of modern-day representations of Druids. Now let's turn our attention to the downfall of the Druids before we wrap things up. By the time the Roman Empire was ascending, the Druids were already on a slow decline. This could have many reasons behind it, among which the Romans themselves. There are theories that put forward the idea that through the process of conquering and assimilating new populations, the Romans diminished the traditional role of Druids in their communities. This was done either through the devastation of the Celtic elite among the populations they conquered by taking out people who would perhaps have enough influence to start uprisings, or simply by buying them off. Another important aspect is that Romans had a very strong aversion to human sacrifices and perhaps retaliated whenever this took place, thus discouraging the practice. Another role the Romans played was by systematically taking out Druidic centers, such as the one on Anglesey, northwest part of Wales, that was attacked over and over again by the Roman army until it was finally conquered in 77 CE by Gnaeus Julius Agricola. But the final blow to Druids came in the form of Christianity. Now, let's go back to the miniature one last time before we wrap things up. And finally, the loincloths. I wanted each of them to be different as they belong to different individuals, of course. Somehow, when I came in with the blue, I smeared paint on the miniature to the far right of the screen. Having 4 minis so close to one another is never good, for me at least, as something was bound to happen eventually. Thankfully, a wet clean brush helped me clean up the miniature. Once the base colors of each loincloth is dry, I will add shadows using Nuln Oil for the blue and green and Druki Violet for the violet and pink, and then add some highlights, bringing everything together. Oh, and I think I'll make the bases blood red for more gruesomeness. What do you think thus far? How does it look? What do you think? Leave a comment down below, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. The Druid is a very important part of pop culture with a very cozy place in video games and in TTRPGs and even in the real world. In games such as World of Warcraft, we see 3 aspects of the Druid: their power to shapeshift, the power to heal, and their use of nature's powers. In TTRPGs such as Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder and many others, we see the same traits but more detailed and with stronger backgrounds. We see their power to heal and to devastate, as well as that of communing with nature. What we don't see is their darker side, even if the ancient Roman and Greek sources are exaggerated. There are archaeological evidence that support these ancient claims. Even if there are isolated events, they are still very dark and still rooted in some truth. Otherwise, the threefold death would not be traced so far back as to Proto-Indo-European and across so many different cultures. While the modern Druids, well, they have nothing to do with the ancient Druids. They resurfaced in the 17th century, and that moment also marked the birth of the studies around Celts and Druids. But let's be honest for a second, they have nothing in common with their ancient counterparts. Sorry to burst your bubble. Now, with that being said and done, remember, you can represent and play Druids however you want. Your game, your world, your rules. I'm just of the opinion that now, knowing the darker side of Druids, this could be incorporated just a little bit in your world. Not having them sacrifice sentient beings, but not being the classic tree-loving, adorable, aloof shapeshifters that can heal, defend, talk to plants and play around with the elements. Just stir in a bit of darkness, you'll see that it makes the other colors pop just a little more. And with that, I would like to thank you for the privilege of your time, and I hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today. I can't wait to see you all funky people here next time on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your dose of miniature painting, history, world building and trivia. Make sure you like, subscribe and share if you enjoyed this video. Remember, be curious, take inspiration from the past and never stop world building and creating awesome things, whatever those are. Your mind and imagination are amazing. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers. Or count the numbers. No. The Druids had the Pythagorean